Well, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I don't mean to say good evening. Good afternoon. It is so good to see you all. We ordered wonderful sunshine. We just got it wrong on the temperature. We had the temperature would equate to how beautiful it looked. I don't know if it still is, if the sun is still shining outside like it was earlier today, but we're certainly happy to have you here. My name is Derek Anderson, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Executive Director of the Columbus Community Relations Commission. Been here since February, so time is truly flying when you're having fun. It still feels like it's February, but we are still thankful for the opportunity of this great service that we have. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first Lunch and Learn series of 2016. And before doing so, I would like to thank members of the CRC staff for putting this together, mainly our the young lady who's spearheading all of our Lunch and Learn series, Sister Gail Gray. There's Sister Gail back there. But the entire team is here to add its support, and we're so very thankful for you and your participation here today to make and have this conversation be as effective and as heartwarming as it can be. And as we thought about who would be a great facilitator for today's session, and we talked about the overall theme of compassion and commitment, Gail said, you know, we have a member of the commission who truly fits the bill on that subject matter. And she said, how about Commissioner Frazier to be the moderator? And I said, oh my goodness, the person with all of that compassion to lead the conversation on compassion? And Gail said, put her down. So following Gail's directive, I'm very happy that our moderator today is a member of the Community Relations Commission appointed by the mayor. We're very happy that she would consent to be the moderator for today. Unfortunately, in her style, we don't have a bio. And I asked her, is there anything you want me to say about you in particular back there? She said, yeah, tell them all the bloody details and tell them the truth. And so let me say to you that it was at our last commission meeting that from the heart, Commissioner Frazier took a topic and subject matter that we don't always deal with, and she presented it to the commission and said, we've got to have a discussion on this. Her passion, her zeal, but more importantly, her compassion to talk to her fellow commissioners and the commission staff really exuded through there, and I am very happy today that our moderator is Commissioner Fran Frazier, who will come now and introduce our panelists and facilitate our discussion today. Would you put your hands together for our commissioner as she comes?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am, on behalf of the commission, has a Education and Issues Committee. And I am a member of that committee. And our chair, Commissioner Allison Poirier, is here as well, so I'm very happy. Thank you. And there are, I think, two other commissioners here, Commissioner Ahanet Kifle and Commissioner Alfie DuBella. And a lot of the commissioners are really busy, so when a commissioner is able to take out time to be here, I just always want to acknowledge that and say thank you so very much. And also, we have a commissioner who's also on the panel, and he will introduce himself last, so now you know who it is. This is what I want to do first. I want the panel to just to introduce themselves and maybe speak for 30 seconds, is that possible, on the organization you might be representing on the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rochelle Martin, and I am the Executive Director of Black Catholic Ministries, the Diocese of Columbus. I am also the Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Franklin County. Thanks, Rochelle. You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Dan Herbert. I'm the atheist. I don't really have any organization that I'm a part of. The closest thing to it would be like the Humanist Society. And I work for the city. I'm up in the 311 Service Center. So.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Renee P. Wormack Keels. Ask me about that sometime. I am currently serving as an intentional interim pastor at the First Baptist Church of Springfield, Ohio. Newly retired or semi-retired from 20 years of pastoral ministry from Boston. And my work is primarily in parish ministry with local churches.
Hello, I'm Nicole Ghazi, and I am probably wearing two hats here today. I am here as the outreach coordinator of the Noor Islamic Cultural Center, but I'm also here because my day job, my Monday through Friday or Sunday through Saturday 9 to 5 job is as the administrator of Muslim Family Services of Ohio, our social service organization.
I'm Harold Berman. I'm the Hidden Commissioner. And appreciate the acknowledgement. I am about to retire at the end of June as rabbi at Congregation Tifereth Israel, a couple of blocks away after 37 years. And on July 1st, I will become the executive director of the National Council of Synagogues, which, as of that date, will be based in Columbus, Ohio, an organization that conducts dialogue on a national level with clergy of different faiths and tries to continue discussion on issues that concern all of us.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, panel. So our topic today is compassion. And it would appear that compassion is that gift of sympathetic consciousness that may be all but gone, or at least it may feel that way. But we know that's not true. We see small glimpses of compassion every day, but I wonder if we're really conscious of that act. Does it actually resonate with us? Does our mind take a picture and then hold on to it for another time when we ourselves need to use this gift of sympathetic consciousness? Across the world, religions, actions, based on our understanding of our religion and the hypersensitivity we show to other people of faith who do not believe or practice their faith in the way that we do not understand, is getting in the way of this sympathetic consciousness. We are all to blame, I think. We don't seem to want to take the time to find out what is the good in our faith that shapes our actions and beliefs and regulates how we operate in the world every day. So today, through a panel of believers, we're going to explore how compassion, this gift that has no allegiance to race, class, religion, belief system, sexual preference, or history, shows up in their walk of faith in what they believe. We have a panel of practitioners who will enlighten us on how to best share this gift of compassion. So I want you to think about your belief system and your own walk in your belief and kind of share the definition of compassion. And we don't have to go in a row. I mean, any of you can speak at any time. Rabbi?
Thought we weren't going in a row. What is this? I would start with possibly the earliest biblical source that we have. There's the fascinating story. And I'll see if I can do this real quick. After the golden calf, Moses speaks to God. Moses at least has this discussion with God about whether this people is worthy of survival, and then Moses says, let me see your face. And God says, you can't see my face, but I'll pass by, I'll cover you over, and then you can see the aftermath of my presence. And God passes by, and God says, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'chanun er chapayim v'rav chesed ve'emet. I just had to impress you with some Hebrew. The Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet not remitting all punishment. So you have this sense that comes out of tradition that says, God is compassionate with a whole series of synonyms in whatever language you want to use, but there also has to be justice. You can't have all mercy, all compassion, and no justice. You can't have all justice and no compassion, or the world wouldn't survive. So as an opening, I think the teaching is this powerful necessity to balance. From the image in the worst of times, God says, I am compassionate, but God also says there is responsibility for our actions.
Thank you. Dan, it looked like you wanted to go.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, compassion is it's a reaction born out of empathy or sympathy. It's just a desire to alleviate somebody else's pain. You can have compassionate actions, compassionate thoughts, do compassionate deeds. But in the simplest form, it really is just a desire to remove pain from someone else.
Thank you.
Can I go next? 'Cause,
Absolutely.
as part of the Judeo-Christian heritage, I'm going with what the rabbi said. I certainly know that when I think about compassion, it is, for me, about how you respond to the suffering of other people. That when you see persons who are going through a particular dilemma, somewhere in our DNA, our compassionate gene kicks in, or there's a way in which we respond to the other and what that individual or individuals are going through.
And just to piggyback off of that, we always look at it as the Judeo-Christian Islamic theology, because being the third of the Abrahamic faiths, we recognize obviously the same teachings that preceded our revelation. And for us in our Quran, compassion is an extremely predominant and prevalent word. It is probably the most common word in the Quran. It comes from the root rahmah. And for those of you who have ever looked at a Quran, every single chapter except for one starts with, and my Arabic is going to be nowhere near as eloquent as the rabbi's Hebrew. I apologize for putting you all through this, but we would say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before we do anything, before we get into a car to drive, before we eat, before we undertake any action in our daily lives. And every single chapter, as I mentioned, except for one, starts with this. And basically to translate that is, basically it just means, that God is the merciful and God is the compassionate. So a definition, if you want to translate Arabic and get into the grammar, both Rahman and Rahim come from the same root. Rahman is an absolute source of mercy. And so that is an attribute that we only ascribe to God because it is an absolute. Whereas Rahim is somebody who is kind or beneficent or benevolent in some way. And so that is a trait of God, but it is also a human trait. So that's sort of how the impact or the importance of compassion plays out in our faith.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as the Catholic person in the room, I would say that compassion is to also recognize the suffering of others and then to take action to help them. The meaning of compassion can be expressed in many different ways. And so as we go along, I will give examples of how compassion is expressed.
Thank you. So now, based on your definition of compassion, is this a human attribute, spiritual attribute that we naturally have, or is it something that has to be cultivated? And then if it is, how do you cultivate it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that intrinsically, God chose to reveal himself in the Quran as the compassionate and the merciful. So we feel that is, since we are divinely inspired beings in our faith tradition, that compassion is intrinsically embedded in human consciousness. Now, does that mean that everybody can practice compassion at the same level? No. I do believe that it is within us, but it definitely is something that is cultivated, sometimes born out of suffering, I think, or challenges that befall us, and how we respond to that and then develop a sense of compassion for others. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Anybody else want to respond?
I will argue, and I'm jumping ahead on your questions perhaps, that it's something that we learn. It is not something we automatically have, and I could throw in another biblical story. I'll do it later, but it is something we learn, and we know a lot of people who aren't compassionate. We know people, too many people, who have somehow or other missed that gift that they were supposed to be given, and I think I would argue, at least out of Jewish tradition, that how you feel is secondary to how you behave. We learn to behave compassionately, whether that's an inborn feeling or not. We are taught to be compassionate because that's the way we are supposed to behave as religious and as good human beings.
I think if you accept the theory that all behavior is learned, that it is something that is taught. I also subscribe to the fact that some things are caught. Some things are taught, some things are caught. If, for example, you grow up in a household or you're around other people who show compassion, you learn that as an example from other persons. I think in my own experience, I learned that from my grandmother, but I also learned that from other people that I was in association with. Only until I got older, I began to understand more about what that meant for me as a responsible human being in caring for my brothers and sisters.
Thanks. So it's a potentially inspired attribute that could be cultivated or learned. So when you look at all of the ways in which we are treating each other these days, could you actually not have compassion at all?
Sure.
I mean, as a human being, just not have compassion. Or do we decide to be compassionate? I mean, do we just choose who we want to be compassionate with?
I think that's possible too.
So anybody want to respond to that?
I think we're overwhelmed with suffering. You cannot turn on the news these days without hearing or seeing about suffering that is happening all over, not only the world, in your backyard, in your own community. And I think we're inundated with how do we respond to the world's suffering? Because when we see something, we think that we are called to do something, we're called to fix it, we're called to change it in some way. And so with all that we are being bombarded with these days, I think we're overwhelmed with what should I do? How do I respond to that? So I think that's part of what's happening.
I agree. I think it's just a very confusing world in that, it's a very global world. So things are really constantly, tossed at us. And I do think that there are people that do not show compassion, that for whatever experience they have had, I refuse to give up on someone. I do believe that God is ultimately merciful and does, there is some shred of decency in everyone, except that absolutely, I think your life experiences shape you as to how you're able to show compassion and if you're able to show compassion. And I do believe that at some point, some people these days can easily be overwhelmed by what they see and what we hear. Yeah.
I also think that when people are suffering from trauma and so much violence, and that they may not be able to express compassion, they may not know how to do it. I think that you have to go deep within to be able to express or show your compassion.
I would also argue that, we not only get burned out sometimes, but we also get abused sometimes. We also do nice things for people which are not reciprocated. And there's a temptation to say, well, nobody cares about me. Why should I care about other people? So we have to keep reminding ourselves that what we need to do is not always think about how other people treat us, but think about how we're supposed to behave toward the world around us. And those obligations are very, 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 very significant.
Can you think of a religion where compassion is not part of its precept? And why do you think maybe there isn't?
I'm not an expert on any religion except mine, so.
Can I quote something that the Dalai Lama said? And that is that compassion is a necessity. It is not a luxury. And that in order for the world to coexist, is that compassion is what we owe ourselves as well as one another.
You looked at me, so you get another biblical story. There's the wonderful, wonderful story of the book of Jonah, in which Jonah is told to go preach to the people of Nineveh, and he runs in the opposite direction because he hates the people of Nineveh. And he'd be very happy to see them destroyed. So, he gets swallowed by fish and all the rest of that stuff. He goes and he preaches to the people of Nineveh, and lo and behold, they repent, and all kinds of good things follow for them, and Jonah is miserable. And God gives Jonah the message, a little kind of graphic thing at the end of the book of giving him some shade, and then the shade is taken away, and he's miserable. And God says, you have compassion on yourself for little things, but here's a city in which there are 120,000 people who don't know their right from their left. That's the biblical quote that comes from the very end of the book of Jonah. And it's not clear whether don't know the right from left means that they're little kids, or whether it just means they're all screwed up. Either way, God says to Jonah, you don't have to like people, you don't have to care about people, you don't have to know people, but you do have to have compassion for people, all people, whether they're your friends or your enemies. And that's the last verse. That's the message we're supposed to take and carry through the generations of how we're supposed to behave toward anybody, friend or enemy.
How do you do that when there are people that you don't like?
I think that's just you have to really go deep within yourself and separate out, and I don't think everybody can do that. I think it is something a very difficult feat, but obviously we deal with every day somebody that perhaps maybe we don't trust, maybe we don't like, maybe we just don't know them. And so how is it that we try to deal fairly with all people is something that our own belief system has to shape and frame, I think. But that is, so whether it's a matter of just liking or whether it's just even a matter of just not knowing the other.
I think too, and the Gospels teach us, Jesus taught that we are to love everybody as we love ourselves. And I often get the question of, Pastor, well, how do I love somebody that I don't like? And I'm like, that's an excellent question. There are people that I don't like, but I love them. and how do you balance that? I think it is a characteristic of the heart, and it is that going within, that you have choices, you have decisions to make. There's a difference between liking things that people do or don't do, and yet at the same time, if you have children, you can perhaps understand, I don't like the things that some of my kids do, but guess what? I love them sometimes in spite of those very things. And I find I need to apply that to people that I come into contact with as well.
So I'm wondering, how do you apply that then to the way religions are treating each other right now? The way groups of people are treating other groups of people based on their own biases? Or how we're treating each other now in this presidential campaign that's going on? How do you apply compassion in there? Somebody who ideologically is just so far removed from where you are. How do you pull up that human attribute and say, you know, you are voting for the wrong person, but I'm going to love you anyway? I mean, how do you get there?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of getting there. It's, you know, again, our faith, you know, tells us very clearly, you know, in our spiritual teachings that when somebody comes at us harshly, has harsh words for us, or that we are to respond with kindness. Mm-hmm. We are to respond with peace.
In spite of how you're treated.
In spite of how we are approached. And that is where human nature, I think, comes in. It's sometimes very hard to do that. Absolutely. And when we get into the politics of the world and what we see globally, you know, in warfare being all set aside, because rules of warfare are obviously, you know, very difficult to imagine. But just in our daily practice, it's just something that, you know, you have to look at what frames your belief system. But, you know, there are backgrounds. You know, it's just, I think sometimes human nature gets in the way of what we want to do. And again, I think it goes back to the earlier topic that you had brought up, that how much, what is too much? You know, at what point do people stop showing compassion? I think it plays in part with that. How much can you be pushed before you hit that breaking point? And it doesn't mean that it's right or that we should. But, you know, human nature can foil our best of intentions sometimes, I think.
So I wanted to ask Dan, I haven't heard from you, Dan. So what I gather is that you really do believe in the power of the human potential.
Right. I mean, earlier when we talked about compassion, whether or not it was a natural quality, I think since humans are social creatures, it's one of the tools that we have naturally to keep our societies together, you know, be it a tribe of 5 or a nation of millions. And that, you know, that compassion can be taught or untaught, depending on the environment you're in. And with the burnout of compassion, I think one of the biggest things is when you show somebody compassion, you are opening yourself up to that same pain. And I think after a while, a compassionate person will just hurt too much from others' pain, and that can cause them to shut down. When you try to show compassion to somebody you don't agree with, for me, it just comes back to remembering that we're all in this together, no matter what. And at the end of the day, you know, as long as you're not hurting someone else, you're just as entitled to your opinion as I am. You know, and recognizing that sometimes we're not going to compromise. We're just going to have to go our separate ways, and in the case of the United States, let the democratic process figure it out. which obviously doesn't work in all countries. But so, yeah, I mean, with the whole burnout and how you deal with the other people, for me, it's just recognizing the basic humanity in everyone else and starting from there.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to your penultimate question. I would argue, despite so many things that have been said to the contrary, that I don't think wars are fought about religion. I think wars are fought about power, control, money, territory, but wars really aren't fought about religion. And within every war situation, you find wonderful, compassionate people who act against the tide and do amazing things. I just finished reading a book that, among other things, talked about people who saved and hid Jewish people in occupied France during World War II. These are people who were not acting on the instructions of their clergy, whatever. They simply believed in what they had been taught and took the teachings of their faith seriously, and so behaved the way they believed their tradition taught them to behave, even if they didn't have leaders standing there telling them to do it. And so they saved lives. They put their lives at tremendous personal risk, and they saved lives. And they did it because they believed that that's what God wanted them to do. And I think people like that are found in many different groups, in many different situations, and they tend to defy the odds that say that religion divides us. I think much more often, in the best sense of where we are, religion brings us together and teaches us to be good to each other and to save each other when the challenge is in front of us.
Thank you. Michelle?
I go back to my belief in Jesus, that he would have me to do the right thing. And my belief system is that I always look to him as my guiding principle. He is my light and my salvation, and so I always go to him. And he teaches me how to behave.
You know, I'm really glad you brought up Jesus, because in many belief systems, there is some deity, some saint, some symbol associated with the gift of compassion. And I was wondering who or what in your belief system symbolizes compassion, and how did that come to be? But I want to share with you, I don't know whether any of you have heard of Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin is the goddess of compassion in the Buddhist faith, and one of the most beloved Buddhist gods. She's also known as she who hears the cries of the world. And because she hears every prayer, she's sometimes represented as having 1,000 arms and eyes, so that any living being in need or needs help can receive her mercy and compassion. And so often she's shown sitting on a lotus, or that has a flower of enlightenment, and the power to work marvels. So most religions have some symbol or deity or saint who is associated with compassion. So I was wondering, in your faith traditions, belief systems, is there some symbol or person who represents that kind of compassion that represents your faith as well?
Well, in our faith, that saint is Saint Martin de Porres. Saint Martin de Porres was a descendant of mixed heritage. He was African and Spanish. And he is also known for his compassion. when he was a young child, his mother would give him money to go and buy groceries. And he would take the groceries that he purchased and give them to the poor on the street because he felt that they needed those groceries more than he did. And so he is a symbol for me and my faith. After reading all about him, I emulate him with my thoughts of compassion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And for me, of course, Jesus would be the symbol. There are probably 21 verses throughout the Gospels that speak about Jesus and compassion. What I love are the stories, and particularly the parable about the Good Samaritan, as Jesus' way of teaching how we should be with one another. And so that story for me is the embodiment of how we treat the least, the lost of these. And so that story of the man on the Jericho road just makes a difference in my worldview about how we treat the other, the stranger, the person who is down and out. And so that helps to shape my thinking as well as my praxis around the issue of compassion. And there was something you were talking about earlier, Fran, that made me think about the fact that as a practitioner, I hear a lot of people's trials, tribulations, struggles, and I know one of the things that we talk about is compassion fatigue. And so I get a lot of stuff, and every now and then I have to say, can I call you back, or can we talk about this another time? Because there's something that I feel is important to practice is self-care. And so if I'm going to be able to continue to provide compassion and empathy, I also need to know where those boundaries are when I've just about reached my limit of hearing. If I hear one more story, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. And so the model for me, like on Sunday morning before I get ready to preach, I tell people, hold your thought until after I'm finished in the pulpit, and then you can tell me all the bad news that you need to share. So it's the self-care.
Okay, thank you. So deity or symbol.
I think really in Islam, first and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, God has chosen to reveal himself as the compassionate and the merciful. Those are his predominant, perfect characteristics mentioned the most often. So I really think that God overall is that image of compassion and ultimate mercy in Islam.
I only got one deity, and no saints, so sorry. But
We're in the same boat.
but tremendous biblical stories, first of all, of commandments that go back and say, you shall not wrong a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, a theme that's going to come up with Passover approaching, and this tremendously important sense that you need to recognize where you've been and try to help others from being in the same straits and being abused. Secondly, there's a tremendous example of the prophets who may rail and scream and say all kinds of horrible things toward the people that they are supposed to deal with, the people who in many cases don't listen to them, but they never give up, and they never stop loving their people. They never stop appealing to God in behalf of their people. They never turn their back on people, no matter how abusive they may be, with the potential that they are still people worth caring about. And I would argue we're taught that all people are worth caring about, and that's what we're supposed to do.
Thank you.
As an atheist, we don't have a deity or any kind of symbols. We tend to look to our fellow humans for their example. Organizations like the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders. individuals that have done compassionate work, like the Reverend Martin Luther King. And we set them up as an example, what have they done? What did it take for them to do it? As examples of how to show compassion.
Thank you. So, Pope Francis, the People's Pope, has declared that 2016 is in the Catholic Church, is the year of mercy. I'm just wondering, just a couple of things I'm wondering about. I had the feeling that this proclamation wasn't just really for the Catholic Church, that it really was a message that perhaps all of us could somehow hold on to. But I'm also wondering too, is compassion and mercy the same, or how do they fit together? And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, but also talk about, is it necessary to have a year of mercy? I mean, what does that do for us?
Well, Catholic. Okay, thank you. Well, compassion and mercy to me are not the same. I mean, compassion is the foundation, I think, for mercy. Mercy is forgiveness to me. In the Catholic Church this past Sunday, we celebrated divine mercy, which means that God forgave us, and it is up to us to forgive others. So when the Pope uses this year of mercy, it is appropriate to forgive others for what they may have done to us.
Thank you.
For me, the difference is mercy always seems to come from a place of power. For me, compassion would be the panhandler helping the businessman up who just tripped. Mercy is more of the cop who doesn't write you the ticket, even though he could. So there's always this power dichotomy with mercy.
Talk more about that. Because you've got people saying,
Right. I always think of the phrases like, you never hear somebody beg for compassion, but you hear them beg for mercy. So when one is being merciful, it's because one is choosing not to inflict a harm they could. Where compassion is choosing to alleviate a harm that they may have not had anything to do with.
you should say that again.
See if I can remember it. So harm is choosing not to, mercy is choosing not to inflict a harm that you could. Compassion is choosing to alleviate a harm that you may have not had anything to do with.
I tend to think of mercy as spiritual and emotional as opposed to compassion, which I think of as behavioral. In a sense, they're both important, one leading to the other. But compassion is really, if you define it that way, and I don't know that the words that have easy definitions, but if you define it that way, then what I'm concerned with it more is people's behavior. But I also want to say, responding to where you started, that Pope Francis has been an amazing spiritual figure for the world. And I just want to acknowledge, as someone who's coming from outside the Roman Catholic Church, that the figure that he's established and the manner in which he is related to his own church has touched the hearts of people way beyond the church in ways that I think have had a tremendous impact on the world. And he has advanced an agenda, a very practical agenda about a lot of different things, which touches us and inspires us and reminds us that we have tremendous obligations, and whether our religious obligations follow those of the church or go in a very different path, we have an agenda, and the way he has articulated that agenda has, I hope, inspired and enlivened all of our religious lives.
Thank you. Rabbi, could you talk a little bit about mercy being something spiritual?
Well, I think the words were used before. Mercy is God's forgiveness, which is nice and very important in a spiritual, religious, self-defining context. But it doesn't necessarily say that there is a behavior associated with all of this that impels us to do certain things. So I like to think that compassion does impel us to behave in certain ways, and whether we feel that mercy accompanies that or not may be secondary.
Thank you.
I think Islamically, I think I follow along that same line in that in mercy, it does imply that there is something being granted, a greater forgiveness, of some sort. And so to us, of course, only, God is the ultimate forgiver, whereas compassion is actually going to that place of suffering with someone. And sometimes we can fix it, sometimes we can't. And sometimes it's just a matter of holding a hand for a while, and we aren't able to solve the problem, but compassion at least drives us to do something, a little bit of something. And so I think along that same line, I see, mercy, the connotation of mercy is something that comes from God, whereas we are all compelled in some way to try to do compassionate, to try to go to that place of suffering with someone, and to truly understand, even if we cannot do something about it.
Thank you. Okay, did you want to say anything, Rochelle? You're okay? All right, good, thank you. I want you to share an experience or a story in which you received compassion or offered compassion. And how did that make you feel?
I'll start.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw this question beforehand, and I kind of racked my brain for a good one. This comes from my teenage years. I was very rebellious, didn't like rules, typical teenager. There was one time I was in the marching band in my high school, and they had this rule about not getting any concessions before your halftime march. They never explained the rule, they just had it. And I thought it was the stupidest thing in the world because, of course, I knew better. So one game night, I used to always sneak down and get 2 sodas, one to drink and one to share with everybody else. And on this night, the band director busted me with them. And we got into a big fight about it. And he ended up taking the sodas away from me. And I, threw a fit and refused to march. After the halftime, I went down because they always fed us hot dogs and soda after the march. And one of the mothers, the band mothers, pulled me aside and took the time to explain the rule to me. How in our town, it was incredibly difficult to get people to pass levies for more money for the schools, and that the band was kind of a symbol to some of these folks, and that we needed to present our best face, not be in dirty uniforms that had pop spilled on them. And that's the major reason for the rule is we needed this kind of thing. And for me, her compassion was taking this rebellious teenager, giving me the respect of explaining something to me. That dignity that, yes, I think you're smart enough to understand, so yeah, I'm gonna explain it to you. Treat you like an equal, give you the reasons. And I think, from that moment on, I think she is one of those formative moments, when I realized that there are probably a lot of rules out there that I don't like, but take the time to explain them to somebody, and you'll usually, get their cooperation.
Thanks,
I would, it's going back a long way, but I was a very young first-year rabbinical student when my mother passed away. And I really just started rabbinical school, and my family lived about half hour, 45 minutes away from where the school was. During the course of the period of mourning, during the week after the funeral, the number of other students and faculty, people who knew me and people who didn't know me, who made it to my home and offered support to my family, whom they didn't know at all, just gave me the insight into what it means when people go out of their way for you at a time when you're feeling most vulnerable. And ever since then, and certainly since I've been a rabbi, I have, whenever a colleague, wherever, loses a family member, I make a point of either making a phone call or of actually writing a note. I still use those things called pens on paper and put them in envelopes because I think that's very, very different from just a couple lines of an email. And I want my colleagues to know that in addition to the formal structures, whoever they're dealing with, they've got friends. And having a community of friends that really care about each other and take, even if it's just a few minutes, to extend themselves personally to someone who is in a very, very vulnerable setting is extremely important. I received it, I felt it, it changed my life in certain ways, it inspired my ministry in certain ways, and it's something that I have continued to try to do for the 40 years since, for anybody to whom I can reach out when they need a hand.
Thank you.
I would like, please, I'll defer to you first.
I experience compassion and mercy, which I think of as divine favor, every week. I commute from Cincinnati to Springfield Wednesday and Thursday, and I have friends in Columbus, our moderator being one of them, who graciously offer me a bed to sleep in, something to eat, maybe a glass of wine every now and then. I took this, that's okay. And so for me, how I feel is loved and valued. And there's a scripture that says, to whom much is given, much is required. And so because I receive those as gifts from friends, I also try to extend that same compassion and gift of favor to others as often and whenever I can.
Well, this story goes many years back for me as well. When I was very young, about 29 years old, I got married. And when I got married, I had no idea that the man that I married was gay. And this devastated me and my life. And his brother also was gay. And at the same time that I found out about his brother, his brother was HIV infected. And at that time, it was at the beginning of the disease. And I needed to find out more about this. So I had to learn mercy and compassion. And I set out to educate other people about HIV. And I trained people all over the country. I was a part of President Clinton's initiative to educate all people in the federal government on HIV and AIDS. So with that, I had to learn forgiveness and mercy from my husband, who ultimately died of AIDS, as well as his brother.
I think I have a lot of privilege sitting on this panel in the job that I do, and I see compassion every day as the director of a social service agency. And absolutely, I think that when we're directly impacted, it resonates a lot stronger for all of us when we have something that comes directly onto our plate. I can see the struggles that my clients go through. And I am I consider myself very lucky to be in the position I am. But I will tell you that recently my husband was in a very serious car accident right before Thanksgiving. And I am the person in the community who manages to run an agency and get things done. And it's amazing what compassion comes your way when you least expect it. And I think that's obviously, when it's most appreciated. Because while my husband was in the ICU, the first person who came, one of the first persons who came was one of my clients, who, struggles to take care of his own family, but made sure that my family was fed. And so it is a very, very humbling experience when somebody wants to give back to you, and how you can accept that grace. And it is truly a grace when that happens. And then this continued for months, as my friends banded together and make sure my children were cared for while I dealt with my husband's recovery. So I think that we all, take those moments. And there are many moments in our lives. I also, when I first read the question, thought, wow, which one should I pick? My client, I can give you, examples of compassionate individuals in my community every day. I needed a bike for a brother to get to work, and within 90 minutes I had 4. There is compassion everywhere, and so how do I choose one? But when it directly impacts you, I do think it does drive home that point. But if you open up your eyes, it is possible to see compassion in lots of places.
Thank you. Any comments? All right, good. So, Renee talked about compassion fatigue, and I know it's becoming more and more prevalent in lots of ways. Adult caregivers who are looking after family members. Michelle can talk about that. The work that we do in communities, where we work, but we're not seeing the reward of our efforts. It's like the more people we provide services for, the more people are coming with the same issues. How do you handle compassion fatigue without losing hope, without losing that spark of grace that Nicole talked about? I mean, how do you get yourself back from all the giving?
A wonderful Talmudic phrase. I'll throw out a little more Hebrew. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. It's not your obligation to finish the task, but that does not excuse you from doing your part. You've got to always remember you can't do everything, but that doesn't hold you back from doing something. If you hand some money to one beggar on the street and that changes his day or changes his life, no, I can't take care of every beggar on every street, but I can do something for somebody, and I can change somebody's day, if not somebody's life. And if I can do that, then I've accomplished something very, very important. Then I have fulfilled an obligation that I have to try to do my part to make the world a better place.
I've just finished reading a book by Margaret Wheatley called Turning to One Another. And in her book, she talks about how we bear witness. and that bearing witness is about our companionship, because lots of times we encounter situations, people suffering, and we want to fix things. And just as we're not called to fix things, but we are called to turn to one another, to sit with those who are going through their go-through, as I call it, and bear witness. I use that as a way of helping many of our members who are part of the calling committee or the visitation committee who say, Pastor, I'm uncomfortable with quote unquote small talk. I don't always know what to do. I said, well, you know, there are times when all we are called to do is just to be, not to try to explain things away, not to try to make everything okay, but just to be there as one who bears witness to what an individual is going through at that time.
Thanks, Renee. Anybody else?
Well, for me, I call on my very dear friends to give me some rest. I also call on Jesus because my mother has Alzheimer's, and I deal with this daily. And sometimes when I'm working with her and I want her to do something for me, I say loudly, Jesus, help me. And in that moment, that peace comes over me to make me regroup, to show that compassion and kindness to her. So calling on my faith.
Dan, I wanted, you're on the 311 call thing, and I know you get a lot of calls, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
How do you not have, tell a little bit about the work you do, but how do you deal with, I know you get compassion fatigue, or do you?
No. There's, you get a lot of people that, I mean, there are big problems and there are small problems. And honestly, we get a lot of the small problems. But, you know, you remind yourself that, you know, the fact that your trash didn't get picked up seems like a small problem. But, you know, this person may have just had the worst day at work, and then they come home to find out that their trash isn't picked up. So it's not just that small problem. You know, so we try to do things that we can to keep our morale up. You know, we always talk to each other. We vent to each other. You know, just go over the day. We talk to each other up there, and that helps a lot. When you've got a whole group of people that are all doing the same thing and all experiencing the same thing, you know, we can, you know, if we're having a bad day, we can like lean on each other. So, I mean, that's, I think having the coworkers is probably the biggest thing that helps us, that there's somebody out there who knows exactly what we're going through. You know, and it's just that reminder that, you know, that these are people, you know, big problem, small problem, they're people and they're just looking for a solution. And there are times when I'll get a caller that really has no problem that I can help them with, but they just want to vent. So I just stay on the phone, listen to them, let them have their say, you know, and at the end of it, I'm like, well, was there anything else I could help you with? And they're like, no, thanks for listening, and that's it.
So that number again is what, Dan?
It's 311, which does not work from every phone, so you might try 645-3111.
And that's a city number, right?
Yep.
Okay. For big complaints and small, or?
Yep, but not water complaints. Water has their own customer service departments.
Okay, well, that's
I
good.
think I've been on that one before for my clients, actually. No, I think that, you know, our tradition teaches us that a person will not be saddled or tasked with more than they can bear. And although that sounds lovely, sometimes it feels like you have more than you can bear. So I think it's important to take the time to find where your support is. And, and I too surround myself with people who can help me out when it gets to be too much. I am thankful for, the various volunteers and staff that we have. I try to maintain at least a little bit of a sense of humor. I recently was outside at about 10:30, 11 o'clock looking to see if it was a full moon because things were just happening beyond my control at work. And so, it's the little things that sometimes you just have to step back from. Absolutely, and find what works for you, whether it's what is a release for you. And I think it's important that we do that. We often don't grant ourselves that space and that time to do that. In this world, everything is instantaneous and needs to be done now, and we all fall into that trap of wanting to do too much. And I think it really is important to find what speaks of peace to you and go there sometimes. When you can.
You talk about compassion fatigue. The truth is that there's simply fatigue, and we get tired. And I regularly say to people, caregivers and others in various settings, you can't help somebody else if you destroy yourself. So there's a rabbinic commentary on the verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which says you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but not more than yourself. You have to love yourself too, which means that you have to make sure that you stay somehow or other fresh and capable of dealing with the world. But the fact that you need to do that can't turn you off from the obligation of continuing to reach out to others as well. It's a very challenging balance.
We're going to take questions, right, where you will supply the answers very soon.
To the best of our ability.
That's right. But I want to ask you, right in our own community, whether it's poverty, whether it's violence, whether it's unemployment, issues around how we're treating people because of their faith or their skin color. Sometimes turbulent times like that impact our ability for compassion to those people, right? Those people. I would like for you to give a word of advice about how to stay compassionate in the midst of that. For any person, whether in this audience or who may be listening, might need to hear.
We are compassionate not because of what we expect to get back, but because it's the right thing to do. And that's, I think, desperately important to remember. I would argue that we do get a lot back. That in so many cases, when we help other people, we get back more than we ever expected, and perhaps more than we ever put into it. But the reason for doing it is not because of what we expect to get back. It's because that's what we, as good, decent, religious human beings, are supposed to do. And if we keep that in mind, then hopefully we have the wherewithal to go forward.
Thank you.
I think that we have a teaching that says that you are not a believer until you want for your brother what you want for yourself. And so it's sort of it implies that the very act of doing something for someone else, or the very act of wishing somebody well, is it kind of separates that sense of competition, and we have to look at it a little differently, that I should not want for my children what I don't want for anybody else's children. We have to look at one another. So belief for us is one thing, but acts and your deeds here on earth are really what prevail and really what determine your salvation in our faith. And I think that it's important to be able to maintain that and to see it not as a religious question, but as a humanity, a sense of humanity and humanness, in that we should all be able to respectfully want for somebody else what we want for ourselves, and recognize that wanting good for someone else is in no way diminishing or in no way a way of gain, for ourselves.
Thank you.
I think that transcends across all religions, because I've heard that principle previously in another way. One of the things I think is so difficult that we sometimes will say is, I know how you feel. And I can't know how another person feels. And I don't want to diminish what they are experiencing or going through. So I kind of have to take a step back and try to think about that experience. And going back to your saying about, I want for others what I would also want for myself or for my children. And that would be a sense of well-being, a sense of being cared for, a sense that I am respected in my humanity. There is an African proverb that says, I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am. And that touches both of us in a place that is almost indefinable. I exist, you exist, and so therefore we are part of this creation of God's together.
Thanks, Renee.
I think it's the importance of the plurality of our society, that there are so many different people, different viewpoints. That kind of thing, you've got to nourish it. That no matter what you may think ultimately of their viewpoint, the fact that we have so many viewpoints is what allows us to achieve so much. That you have to keep that in mind, to keep striving to help whoever needs help, and to just bring about the best community you can, bringing in the most different kind of people. I've never, the exclusionary viewpoint, I think, does more harm ultimately than anything else.
Thank you, Dan. Michelle?
Well, for me, I think that that I go back to my faith, and that it is upon me to make people feel better when I am approached with what they need from me. Giving of myself is important. And I know that I will be taken care of no matter what. But for me to give of my time and myself is what is crucial, and compassion makes that for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we've got time for maybe 2 questions? 2. Yeah, come right here so they can hear you.
Thank you. I want to make a comment that draws on, I think, on a number of things that I've heard. Some of you may be aware of the Charter of Compassion. It's a global focus. Karen Armstrong was the person who sort of pulled this together, MacArthur Genius recipient. And the idea was that so often religions, she's written a lot on all kinds of faiths as well, but usually we think about how are we different? How are pulling ourselves aside? And she wanted to bring a group together, which she did, included Jimmy Carter from the United States and others all over the world, to ask the question, what do we have in common? Cross faith. And the golden rule was basically what they came up with. And I think there's 17 faiths that have some version of it. Several of you mentioned it in your own comments. You know, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. Don't do unto others that you don't want unto you. But it's that notion of basically of empathy and of compassion, of saying basically, how would I want to be treated as a guideline for how we should treat other people. And I just wanted to bring that up. So, and you can go online and find it, and there's lots of resources around it. Thank you.
But I have a question for the panelists. They were that good, really? Actually, they were pretty wonderful. Oh, good. Sure, love to.
Thank you to all the panelists for the theological reflections. It was really insightful. My name is Molly. Hey, I'm with the Columbus People's Partnership, and I helped start the Ohio Student Association. I think one of the themes that we were hearing a lot was around how hurt people. And one of my questions to you all is, how do people of faith help us imagine a new paradigm where, I mean, all of our systems are based off of punitive justice, where we must punish the person who does the wrong versus healing the people who have been harmed. And given the, I think in our community right now, I mean, Columbus City Schools has lost 18 children, youth, to gun violence this year. We've got 4 out of 5 kids in our school district living in poverty. Yes. It's unacceptable. Yes. And I think that we have to, as community members and as people of faith, social servants, agency providers, we actually have to start to think about all of these people who are doing harm have been harmed. And how do we start to change the paradigm about how we get to the root causes and start to heal rather than to punish?
Panelists?
I mean, that is the crux of the issue, Our faith teaches us that, yes, we do have, in our religious law, that we do have the right for retribution, like the punitive component of it, but that it is better for us to forgive. However, how do we put those words into action is something that we don't have that much time left, I'm afraid. But yeah, how do we kind of come together as faith-based institutions? And I just served on another panel on the weekend, and then was a participant in a meeting with some members of the Jewish community a couple weekends ago on how can we band together and serve. And we are doing it already. I mean, I work with a lot of different agencies. I share cases with churches. We certainly have a lot of cross faith interactions and with civic and secular groups as well. But it is something that, how are we going to come together to do more? It is really frightful. We have a lot of families that live in the Columbus Public School District, and I see those children are hungry. And we are doing our best to get food out there. But yeah, how do we do more, and how do we come together for that is something that, is a big question. And, the little bit we're doing obviously is not enough. We need to do more.
Well, I don't certainly have any answers, but I have some thoughts. I've worked a lot in the criminal justice system for about 20 years, and one of the principles that we've tried to work on is something called restorative justice. Some of you may know of that. And my experience has been in getting people who have been harmed in the room with people who have done the harming, and having us to sit down and have conversation. We focus so much on what's different about us, but there's so much more that we have that is in common. And how do we really learn how to sit down and talk with one another across those differences? It's not an easy thing to do, but I've seen the results of people who have done that come out with not only being forgiven, but forgiving. And I think that is part of the ongoing conversation. If we are able to be in dialogue one with the other, all of those things that we think really divide us really are, I won't say they're inconsequential, but they become less important than when we meet each other one-on-one or two-to-one, two-to-two, or however. And that's through the dialogical process, that we talk to one another so that we have a way of entering into the world of the other and being able to have some understanding. We may continue to disagree, but we still have the opportunity to dialogue and have deeper understanding.
There's a wonderful teaching that even someone who receives charity is not excused from giving charity. No matter how little you have, you can always do something to help someone else. And our obligations to the collective community and to the betterment of the community around us are not absolved, or we're not absolved just because we're also hurting. So we need to teach in a certain context, and we need to remind ourselves in other contexts that even when we're hurt, even when we've been hurt, and that's the hardest lesson to learn. That's very obvious from exactly what's been said. Even when we have been hurt, our obligation to help other people out of hurt is not canceled.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Go ahead.
Go, you go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's the cycle of hurting, hurt. For a long time, we've just been dealing with the aftermath, locking up the people that do the hurting. And a lot of the things I think we're focusing on now is getting to the root causes, like children that are going hungry, getting them fed so that they don't have that hunger affecting them. I think another important thing we can be doing to help get one of the root causes out of the way is a much better medical system, where somebody who's got mental health issues can get the help they need, not on a waiting list, but immediately, where people aren't afraid to go to the doctor, aren't afraid to find themselves bankrupt because they're sick and have to deal with all of that stress, which causes anger, which causes them to lash out, which causes them to hurt. There's a lot of different root causes, but I think that's a big one, and I think it's a solvable one. I think we really, if we focus in on the mental health, and just health overall, you'll find much happier, less stressed people who can then deal with the other stresses of life in more appropriate ways.
Thank you. Michelle, you have 3 seconds.
Okay. We have had, Fran and I came together and had conversations with youth around Columbus and Franklin County. And I think we need to have more conversations because we have made some inroads, but we need to talk more. And I would be willing to, wouldn't you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Love to.
Come together and do more of it.
Love to. I really want to thank our panel, Rabbi Harold Berman, Nicole Ghazi, Reverend Dr. Renee Warmack-Keels, Dan Herbert, and Rochelle Martin. Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to remind you that May 13th is our next Lunch and Learn series on compassion. We're going to be talking about victims of crime. Really hope you can join us again at 11 for networking, and then our panel discussion will start at 11:30. I would like to leave you with this. We heard today that your compassion can transform you, that with your eyes and hands you can help others. With your compassion you can bring peace and tranquility to your world and the world of others. So may the happiness you bring to others today come back to you 1,000-fold. Thank you.